Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Ray Rosentrader for his gracious introduction and for organizing this event, as well as Paul C. Wilt, the Gady Institute, and the Provost's Office for their support. I'd also like to recognize and thank my collaborator on this research project, Dr. Philip Truscott, at Southwest Baptist University. What do you think of when you hear the words campus sexual assault? Are you reminded painfully of the trauma and violation that you or someone close to you endured, most likely by someone you or they knew and thought could be trusted? Do you reflect upon the documentary The Hunting Ground, most recently screened here on Westmont's campus a couple of weeks ago, which gives several campus sexual assault survivors firsthand accounts of the ways in which university administrators failed to adequately address their victimization and punish their assailants? Do famous cases of campus sexual assault come to mind, such as then Columbia University senior M.S.W, who gained national attention in fall 2014 when she used her senior visual arts thesis project as a form of political protest. Her project, titled Mattress Performance, Carry That Weight, involved her hoisting the mattress you can see here in the slide, on which she claimed to have been sexually assaulted, everywhere she went, until her alleged assailant was expelled. When he was not expelled, and instead graduated alongside of her, she carried the mattress across the stage during commencement. Do you think of the two Vanderbilt University football players who were convicted in early 2015 for the gang rape of a fellow student? Video evidence in this case showed that the unconscious victim was carried away from a public setting while onlookers looked on and failed to intervene. Do you think of the 2016 sentencing of a former Stanford University student to only 6 months in county jail after being found guilty of assault with intent to commit rape of an intoxicated woman, sexually penetrating an intoxicated person with a foreign object, and sexually penetrating an unconscious person with a foreign object? Do you think of the recent scandal at Baylor University, in which numerous sexual assault allegations made against members of their football team over the course of several years were not reported, but instead actively covered up, resulting in the demotion of the university then president and the firing of the head football team coach? Again, what do you think of when you think of campus sexual assault? Do you think of California's Yes Means Yes bill, passed in August of 2014, which requires that all colleges and universities that receive state aid make affirmative consent a part of their sexual assault policies? New York, Connecticut, and Illinois have since also passed similar measures. Do you think of the 2014 It's On Us campaign, created as part of then President Barack Obama's efforts to combat sexual and domestic violence? The campaign strived to help students recognize what qualifies as a sexual assault, encouraged bystanders to speak up if they witness sexual misconduct on campus, and urged students to never participate in the victim blaming of survivors. Perhaps do you think of U.S. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's speech in Washington, D.C. less than 2 weeks ago, rescinding Obama-era guidelines on campus sexual assault investigations and raising the recommended standard of proof that colleges should use in deciding whether a student is responsible for an alleged sexual assault? Again, what do you think of when you think of campus sexual assault? Do you perhaps feel suspicion that individuals claiming to be victims of sexual assault are actually lying? Or that they may have done something wrong in their actions, in their apparel, or lifestyle to provoke the attack? Do you instead feel fear or anxiety that it could happen to you or to someone that you care deeply about? Or perhaps do you feel frustration or even a sense of helplessness that we continue to be a society in which violence against women and other marginalized groups remains so prevalent? As we gather here to consider this weighty topic, it's important to acknowledge that we all come with different experiences, beliefs, knowledge, and perspectives. It is equally vital to acknowledge that campus sexual assault is a challenging topic to discuss on a variety of levels and for myriad reasons. It is an unpleasant and disturbing reality. For some, it is an intensely personal and painful part of their life experience. It is uncomfortable to acknowledge that Christian colleges, including Westmont, are not immune from this social problem, and that individual Christians can and do experience sexual assault. It is also unsettling to reflect upon how we, individually and collectively, might play a role in sustaining a rape culture in the United States. Discomforting though it is an important topic, and I am grateful that each of you here this evening have chosen to reflect upon it with me. This evening, I'm going to share with you the results of a recent research project that I conducted with my collaborator, Philip Truscott. I'll begin by giving you some background information that will contextualize what precisely we investigated and why. I will next orient you to the research questions we posed, as well as the research methods we used to answer them. Then I will share our major findings, what we found that was expected, what we found that was unexpected, what we do know, the limits of what we currently know with the available data, and what needs to be explored in the future. Finally, I will discuss what these results might mean and their varied and quite divergent implications. So we'll start with campus sexual assault and its prevalence. Sexual assault is a widespread social and public health problem in the United States, and hundreds of studies have investigated its prevalence, correlates, and aftermath. Although men do experience sexual assault, various studies examining the prevalence of victimization have found that women experience between 2.5 to 6 times more assaults compared with men. Approximately 18% to 20% of women in the United States experience an attempted or completed rape during their lifetimes. Campus sexual assault is of particular concern, of course, to a variety of stakeholders, including college administrators, parents, students, and researchers, especially in light of prevalence research documenting that between 11.5% and 19% of female college students in the US are sexually assaulted during their college years. However, a recent pilot study regarding undergraduate sexual victimization on 9 college campuses found a wide range, so a range between 12% and 38% of female students who were sexually assaulted during their college years. And what that study suggests is that campus sexual assault rates may vary substantially from campus to campus. We'll come back to this idea of the wide range in campus sexual assault rates shortly. Now, regarding how do we explain campus sexual assault and what are some of the correlates of it, here's an overview of some of the research. So the explanations regarding the high rate of sexual assault among college students span the micro to macro continuum. The factors at various levels interact with each other. At the micro level, a substantial body of research has examined individual characteristics and behaviors. Among college women, experiencing assault is positively associated with alcohol use, higher numbers of dating partners, more frequent consensual sexual experiences, low sexual assertiveness skills, a prior history of sexual victimization, and having a lower grade point average. Among college men, perpetrating sexual assault is positively correlated with having early and frequent sexual experiences, having rape-supportive beliefs, frequent and heavy alcohol consumption, and frequent misperception of women's sexual intent. So moving back a step from the micro to the meso, at the meso level, researchers have investigated things like campus characteristics, high-risk settings, and community characteristics. Regarding campus characteristics, campus crime rates in general are positively associated with such factors as higher levels of each of these, higher levels of student enrollment, students residing on campus, and full-time students. Some researchers have examined the impact of specific university practices and characteristics, such as enforcing strict penalties for drinking in residence halls and having enough comfortable spaces, and what those characteristics, how they impact campus sexual assault. Other researchers have examined specific contexts, such as partying-oriented fraternities, that pose greater risk of sexual assault to female students. Regarding community characteristics, researchers back in 1995 examined 530 colleges and communities and concluded that college and community crime rates appear to be largely unrelated. At the macro level, there are three theoretical emphases in the violence against women literature that I'll highlight here. First, the contemporary US remains a patriarchal society with pervasive structural systems of inequality that systematically privilege men and disadvantage women. Second, both women and men are bombarded with gendered messages from such sources as television shows, movies, music, commercials, internet sites, and video games regarding male power, authority, aggressiveness, and sexual dominance, as well as female objectification, sexualization, passiveness, and subservience. And finally, the interactions of women and men at the micro level are substantially impacted by larger social structures, social institutions, and social norms that affirm, reinforce, and reify men's violence, power, authority, and control over women. One example of an important line of research that connects these larger theoretical principles to the perpetration of sexual assault is research on rape culture. Rape culture refers to a set of beliefs and values that creates a cultural environment that promotes rape. Rape culture reduces the likelihood that bystanders will intervene in incidents of sexual assault, provides perpetrators with culturally legitimated excuses for their behavior, makes it more difficult to hold offenders accountable, and makes it less likely that survivors will recognize that they have been criminally victimized. It also shifts the responsibility and blame from perpetrators to victims. So now we're going to switch gears briefly and think about a separate topic, religion. So according to the Pew Research Center's 2014 data, religion plays a substantial role in the lives of over 160 million Americans, with slightly more than half, 53%, of Americans claiming that religion is, quote, very important in their lives. Sociologists and psychologists of religion have long been interested in the effects of religiosity upon human behavior and well-being. Religious involvement is positively associated with such pro-social behaviors as charitable giving and volunteering, as well as with subjective well-being, life satisfaction, and physical and mental health. It is negatively associated with depression and anxiety, and religion appears to have stress buffering effects. Now, during the 1970s through the 1990s, there was substantial debate regarding the relationship between religiosity and crime. Currently, however, there's a general consensus that a negative correlation exists. Religious involvement is associated with decreased delinquency, substance abuse, and violent offending. Religiosity is also an indirect predictor of violent victimization, such that individuals with high religiosity experience lower levels of victimization. And in a rare community-level analysis, Lee, in 2006, documented that counties with more churches per capita had lower rates of rural violence. Less, however, is known about the relationship between religiosity and intimate partner violence. Some religious beliefs, for example, regarding marriage, divorce, and gender roles, as well as the responses that battered women receive from clergy, family members, friends, and their faith communities, have been shown to serve as a barrier to women's help seeking. However, several scholars have found religion's effects upon abused women to be mixed. For example, one study found that spiritual beliefs gave some women the strength to leave their abusive spouses, while another researcher found that religious institutions and networks can be important sources of support for battered women. Regarding the relationship between religiosity and the prevalence of intimate partner violence, several studies have documented that weekly attendance at religious services is inversely associated with domestic violence perpetration and victimization. So what that means, in short, is that religious involvement appears to have a protective effect against experiencing or perpetrating domestic violence. What's interesting, though, is there's no prior research that addresses the question of whether religiosity impacts sexual assault prevalence or reporting. Also, most research on campus sexual assault overlooks the important differences in campus sexual assault rates between U.S. states. So sociologists, as you likely know, are intrigued by patterned differences across a population, and we want to understand the factors that might be causing them. These gaps in our collective understanding of these topics motivated this study that I'm about to share with you. One last bit of background information that will be helpful to know before I begin to tell you about this project is just a basic overview of the Clery Act. So in 1990, Congress passed the act that came to be known as the Jean Clery Disclosure of Campus Security Policy and Campus Crime Statistics Act, known better as the Clery Act. The Clery Act requires federally funded institutions of higher education to report incidents of specific categories of crime, distribute an annual security report, and publish their policies regarding crime prevention programs and post-incident procedures. These data are submitted to the U.S. Department of Education, and they're publicly available. The Clery Act has been amended several times. In its current form, it requires colleges and universities to report crimes that occur on campus that have been reported through formal procedures in the following categories: murder, manslaughter, rape, fondling, incest, statutory rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, motor vehicle theft, arson, hate crimes, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. So that's kind of the background to understand the study I'm about to present. So please fire up your sociological imaginations and join me in examining the patterns of differences regarding campus sexual assault rates in the United States and in thinking through what these differences might mean. So we explored the following 4 research questions. First, what is the relationship between state-level religiosity and campus sexual assault rates in the United States? Second, does this relationship vary by denominational affiliation or lack of religious affiliation? Third, what is the relationship between state-level religiosity and other categories of campus crime? And finally, fourth, if the hypothesized negative correlation between state-level religiosity and campus sexual assault rates exists, is the correlation due to geographical differences in reporting sexual assault or differences in the prevalence of the behaviors themselves? We tested 3 hypotheses. First, that states' religious service attendance rates will be negatively correlated with campus sexual assault rates. Second, that there'll be a positive correlation between states with higher percentages of non-religious persons and campus sexual assault rates. And third, that states' religious service attendance rates will be negatively correlated with non-sexual campus crime rates. To clarify a few terms really quickly, the Rape Reportage Gap, which you'll hear me talk about, is the difference between the number of attempted or completed rapes self-reported by the National Crime Victimization Survey sample and the incidents those individuals reported to the police. As you can imagine, victimization surveys yield much higher numbers, much higher prevalence rates than surveys that involve a formal reporting of the crime. I use the terms religiosity and religious involvement interchangeably to refer to a common indicator of religious engagement, the frequency of religious service attendance. Okay, so here's a little bit about the methods. To explore the relationship between religiosity and campus sexual assault rates, we analyzed data from two sources: the Pew Religious Landscape Study, which has about 35,000 people, and Clery Act campus crime data. The Clary Act data include records for about 11,593 campuses, which includes nearly the entire enrollment of college and university students in the US, so a bit over 18 million individuals. Since the most recent religious landscape data are from 2014, we chose to use campus crime data from that same year. The measure of religiosity used in this article is the rate of weekly religious service attendance, and it's important to note that this variable describes religious service attendance in general, regardless of religious affiliation. So crime rates per state were calculated by summing the total number of crimes in each category for each institution and then each state. Next, we totaled the number of students enrolled within each state, and so the crime rates I present show the number of crimes in each state per 100,000 students enrolled in that state. As of 2014, the Clary Act required colleges and universities to report 3 types of sexual assault: rape, fondling, and incest. Incest, though, is thankfully quite rare. Only 2 cases in 2014 were reported, so we omitted this category. And since our preliminary findings indicated a negative correlation between religiosity and campus sexual assault, we next conducted exploratory analyses to determine if the association was due to geographical differences in reporting sexual assault or differences in the prevalence of the behaviors themselves. These analyses also included data from 2 sources: the National Crime Victimization Survey and the first and second waves of the Pew Religious Landscape Study. One of the main functions of the National Crime Victimization Survey, which I'll refer to as the NCVS after this, is to identify crime incidents that go unreported to police. It contains data on both attempted and completed rape incidents. So for each incident, respondents are asked, did you make a report to the police? The NCVS does not report data at the level of the 50 states. Rather, its smallest unit describes the 4 census regions of the US in order to cover the same years as the Pew Religious Landscape Study, we examined NCVS data from 2007 through 2014, which included 252 rape incidents. We also analyzed a subset of those cases with a small sample size, only 49, in which the respondents indicated that they were students. It's important to note the results of that analysis, where it's a student-only subset, only 49 people, should be interpreted cautiously due to the small number of cases. In addition, the NCVS data does not tell us if those incidents with the students happened on campus. I plan to explain our data analyses procedures as I present the results. So hopefully you have the tables, the packet that is a handout. And if not, if you have extras, if you can pass those to anyone who does not have them or share with someone near you, that would be fantastic. So with regard to our first research question, Table 1, which takes up the first 2 pages, it's a long table. It has all 50 states and Washington, D.C. But that table shows for each state religious service attendance rates, campus rape rates, and fondling rates. Pearson correlation coefficients were calculated to show the strength of association between religious service attendance and the rates of sexual assault. Confirming our hypothesis, there were significant negative correlations between religious service attendance and campus rape rates and campus fondling rates. So, in other words, higher religious service attendance rates in a state are correlated with lower campus sexual assault rates. So take, for example, Vermont. It's on page 2 of your packet. The states are listed alphabetically. So once you get to Vermont, you'll see that 23% of those living in the state of Vermont attend weekly religious services. And Vermont also has the highest campus rape rate and the second highest campus fondling rate. New Hampshire and Maine have very similar patterns and are good examples. But now take a look at a state, take your pick, Utah, Texas, or South Carolina, which have the opposite. They have high religious service attendance rates, 50% or higher. These states have much lower campus rape and fondling rates. There are outliers, of course, but the overall correlation between these two variables is strong. Regarding our second and third research questions, Table 2, so page 3 in your packet, shows a correlation matrix for a set of state-level religion variables and campus crime rates. Certain crimes reportable under the Clery Act had 0 values for most of the states and have thus been omitted from the table, and that included murder, manslaughter, incest, statutory rape, and arson. Because the latest amendments of the Clery Act did not go into effect until July 1st of 2015, and our study ended with 2014, our data do not include hate crimes, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. Contrary to our hypothesis, there was little to no correlation between religiosity and non-sexual campus crime rates. The most significant correlations all described types of sexual assault. As hypothesized, the proportion of people in each state reporting no religious affiliation, that's a group often referred to as religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. So it's folks who enter, what's your religious affiliation? None. So the spelling on that's crucial. But the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, if a state has more individuals who do not affiliate with a religion, there's a positive correlation. They have higher rates of rape and fondling. So these correlations raise the following question. Is a lower proportion of sexual assault incidents reported to the police in geographical areas with higher levels of religious service attendance? In other words, as we query in our fourth research question, is the negative correlation between religiosity and campus sexual assault rates due to geographical differences in reporting sexual assault or differences in the prevalence of the behaviors themselves? So again, the question here, what we've established so far, is that in states that have higher levels of weekly religious service attendance rates, there are lower levels of reported campus sexual assault, both rape and fondling. But how to interpret that is going to be the subject of the next part of the study. So using National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS data, we conducted exploratory analyses to investigate possible regional differences in the proportion of rapes that are reported to the police, and we compared them to the regional religious service attendance rates. What you see on the screen is the same as your Table 3, which I believe would be page 4 in your packet. This is the only one that fit on the slide, so that one's here. Table 3 shows the religious service attendance and rape incident reportage to the police for the 2007 to 2014 subset of NCVS cases, broken down by census regions. But again, those are large regions, 4 regions for the entire United States. We also examined the student-only subset of these cases, again, 49 people, although the results should be interpreted with caution because of the small sample size. There is considerable regional variation in the proportion of rape incidents reported to the police, and you'll see that in your Table 3. However, the census region with the highest religious service attendance, so take a look at the South. The South has religious attendance of 47% or so. They also have the highest rape incident reportage rate to the police. 47% of the general population reported to the police, 63% of that small student sample. Likewise, the census region with the lowest religious service attendance rate, the Northeast, also had the lowest rape incident reportage rate, about 8% among the general population, closer to 11% among students. So we used chi-square statistics, using cross-tabulation of census regions by police reportage for all rape incidents to see if those patterns are actually statistically significant. And the result is that they are statistically significant differences, both for the general population and for the student-only subset. Tables 4 and 5, these are in your packet on that same page, show the results of a binary logistic regression where the value 1 represents a police report for a given incident of attempted or completed rape, while the value 0 represents all other cases, people who did not report to the police. Table 4 shows an analysis containing all cases in the NCVS file from 2007 to 2014. The result is a significant positive coefficient for religious service attendance. Table 5 shows the same logistic regression using just that student subset. The religious service attendance coefficient is still significant despite the restriction in the number of available cases. So in short, you've seen the first 3 bullet points here. It's just the last one that is added. The logistic regression results that you saw in tables 4 and 5 do not provide any support for a negative association between religious service attendance and rape reportage. Rather, these data suggest that there's a positive association between religious service attendance rates and the probability that an attempted or completed rape will be reported to the police. This was a surprising finding to us, but again, it's important to reiterate that the NCVS analyses are exploratory, given the lack of state-specific geographical information and the small number of student assault incidents in the data set. So, to recap a little bit, the purpose of this study was to investigate the relationship between religiosity and campus sexual assault rates in the US. Our first hypothesis, that states' religious service attendance rates would be negatively correlated with campus sexual assault rates, was confirmed. I will discuss 2 possible explanations for this finding and their vastly different implications in a moment. Second, our hypothesis that there would be a positive correlation between states with higher percentages of non-religious persons, the religious nuns, and campus sexual assault rates was also confirmed. And third, our hypothesis that states' religious service attendance rates would be negatively correlated with non-sexual campus crime rates, with burglary, robbery, aggravated assault, and vehicle theft, was not supported. There was not a statistically significant relationship. So states with higher percentages of people who are attending religious services, those states do not show lower campus crime rates for the non-sexual crimes. The lack of a correlation between states' religious service attendance rates and other non-sexual campus crime rates is noteworthy. One potential explanation is that among the 6 types of crime examined in this study, rape and fondling may be the only crimes in which the majority of perpetrators are other students. As several scholars have documented, approximately 90% of campus sexual assault is perpetrated by an acquaintance of the victim, and that's different from other crime categories. So perhaps to the degree that religiosity in the social environment increases social control over individuals, this effect might be lessened for crimes perpetrated against strangers or people's personal belongings. But future research is needed to examine this unexpected finding. So now we're turning to the crux of the issue, the prevalence versus reporting question. As referenced earlier, the significant correlations between campus sexual assault and religiosity have 2 broad categories of explanation. The first is that the difference in campus sexual assault rates is due to less reporting of campus sexual assault incidents, perhaps due to these campuses being located in more socially conservative areas of the country, where there might be more victim blaming and stigma associated with experiencing sexual assault, or a suppression of reports by campus administrators. The second explanation is that the difference in campus sexual assault rates is due to differences in the prevalence of behaviors across states, with less campus sexual assault actually occurring in states with higher levels of religious service attendance. In our exploratory analyses, we were only able to indirectly examine these two competing explanations. We found that there were statistically significant regional differences in the rape incident reporting rate to the police. Moreover, we found that at the level of U.S. Census regions, there was a statistically significant positive association between religious service attendance and the probability of rape incident reportage, both among the total NCVS sample and the student-only subset. So that last part is that in the census regions, individuals in states with more religious service attendance were more likely to report those incidents to the police. So the results of our analyses of the relationship between the religiosity of census regions in the US and the rape incident reportage rates of the total and student-only NCVS samples certainly prevent us from ruling out the prevalence explanation. However, the NCVS analyses should be viewed as exploratory, not definitive in nature. This ambiguity highlights the lack of student sexualization surveys that include geographical data, even among several recent prominent surveys of sexual violence. So for example, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey does not ask respondents whether or not they are current students, or if a particular assault took place on a college campus. The Campus Climate Survey on sexual assault and sexual misconduct obtained respondents from only 27 institutions out of the 18 million of higher education. And so they're providing data that are so highly clustered that you can't really look at regional rates of victimization or reportage, let alone a state-by-state breakdown. Similarly, the Campus Climate Survey Validation Study included data from only 9 college campuses throughout the US, and its authors specifically state that it was not intended to be nationally representative. So, to definitively answer the question of prevalence versus reporting, a new nationally representative survey is needed that combines college student sexual victimization prevalence and reporting data with state-level geographical data. So setting aside that we don't fully know the answer to this question, let's think about for a bit, how could state-level religiosity impact campus sexual assault rates? So if it is possible, the way that our exploratory research suggests, that the geographical variations in campus sexual assault are due to differences in prevalence, then we must consider the possible factors involved. One explanation is that states with higher levels of religiosity may have college campuses in which partying culture is less widespread. This would involve decreased levels of alcohol use, drug use, casual sex, and hookup culture. A substantial body of research links higher levels of campus sexual assault with individuals' alcohol use, drug use, and having early and frequent consensual sexual experiences. A second possible explanation is that a context in which a large percentage of youth and young adults have had regular religious involvement exposes youth to pro-social modeling, leads to the development of pro-social norms, and increases their social capital. For example, in a research study, King and Furrow examined the relationship between religiousness and moral outcomes among a sample of 735 urban adolescents. They found that the social capital of the more religiously involved youth, so specifically their development of trusting, non-familial, and intergenerational relationships within religious communities, was a mediating factor in predicting the adolescent's moral outcomes. So social capital in this case refers to the bonds that we might develop when we're a part of religious institutions and regularly attending them. So that's what their work looked at. Salas Wright and colleagues in a different study used data from a nationally representative sample of adolescents to examine the relationship between religiosity and teens' use of violence. The researchers asserted that involvement in formal religious services, quote, expose adolescents to a pro-social adult community and pro-social norms. According to these studies, the effects of religious service attendance include the development of social capital, as well as pro-social socialization and modeling. A third possible explanation is that religiosity affects not only those who directly engage in it, but also the broader social environment. This is a sociological concept that's consistent with Stark and colleagues' moral community hypothesis, and they draw upon the work of Emil Durkheim. According to this theory, the moral community hypothesis, religiosity is not merely an individual characteristic, but is also a group attribute. As such, religiosity must be understood as occurring within a social context. The basic idea here is that in geographical areas in which religion permeates the social environment, where there's some unknown percentage what the tipping point is to kind of what makes it permeate the social environment. But when you have enough people who are holding the same religious value system, and that culture is surrounding an individual, even if that person themselves does not believe in those values, the individual is more likely to act in accordance with those widely shared values in that culture. Again, even if she or he is not themselves religious. And there's been research in support of the moral community hypothesis. So for an example, Regeneris in 2003 found that delinquency, even among non-religious adolescents, was reduced in counties with a higher proportion of conservative Protestants. More recently, Lee found a negative correlation between the number of churches per capita in a county and the rate of violent crime in rural areas. So prior research provides some conceptual framework for explaining how state-level religiosity may impact campus sexual assault, even among individuals who are not themselves religious. But further research may fruitfully clarify the relationship between the social ecology of a state and its campus sexual assault rate. The substantial geographical variations regarding campus sexual assault found in this study are important, regardless of whether they are due to differences in campus sexual assault prevalence or differences in reporting. But these two explanations have vastly different implications. So let's first take a look at the implications if the reporting explanation is the accurate one. So if the geographical variations in campus sexual assault are the result of reporting differences, not prevalence, simply reporting, between various states and regions in the country, then there are several really important implications. First, enhanced efforts are needed on college campuses, especially in more religious areas of the country, to reduce the stigma and victim blaming often associated with sexual assault victimization, provide supportive services to survivors, and inform the student body regarding the procedures for, benefits of, and protections available to sexual assault survivors reporting an assault. Such measures may reduce the self-suppression of reporting. Second, if sexual assault reporting is being suppressed by college administrators, so what was found to be the case at Baylor University, then the institutional penalties delineated in the Clery Act need to be applied or potentially enhanced. According to the Clery Act, the U.S. Department of Education can issue a civil fine of up to $35,000 per violation for misrepresenting or failing to report campus crime data. Moreover, in light of very recent research, Jung in 2015, documented that universities being audited for Clery Act violations suddenly reported 44% more sexual assaults during the audit period. And then, right afterwards, their post-auditing reporting decreased to the level of their pre-audit reporting. That kind of research would tell us that maybe higher levels of scrutiny are necessary. One way of addressing this would be to have randomized audits of all institutions of higher education, and that might be one part of the solution. Finally, if the religiosity of a geographical area negatively impacts sexual assault reporting, then religious institutions should take a more active role in combating rape culture and rape-supportive beliefs. This includes efforts to reduce problematic gender ideologies and stereotypes, such as violent and domineering masculinity and passive and subservient femininity. Religious institutions should also seek to reduce the stigmatization of sexual assault and of their survivors, which may include informational campaigns aimed at all members, providing resources for and referrals to survivors of sexual assault, and providing educational programs for youth regarding rape myths and sexual assault. Now let's think about the implications of the alternate explanation. So, alternately, if the geographical variations in campus sexual assault are the result of prevalence differences between various states and regions of the country, then the implications are quite different. First and foremost, since this is the first study to examine this correlation, additional research is needed in order to really examine the processes through which state-level religiosity may reduce sexual assault rates in general and campus sexual assault rates in particular. These mediating factors may be related to specific religious or moral beliefs, individuals' bonds to society, the protective effects of membership and time spent in pro-social groups, increased campus and community cohesiveness, or other unknown factors. Second, there should be increased funding for and widespread implementation of bystander intervention programs and other campus sexual assault prevention efforts that have been documented to promote pro-social norms, encourage social responsibility, and enhance campus community cohesiveness. Examples of these successful programs include Mentors in Violence Prevention, Bringing in the Bystander, and Green Dot. They've shown promising results in increasing knowledge regarding sexual assault, challenging sexist attitudes, reducing rape myth acceptance, enhancing individuals' willingness to intervene, and in some cases, increasing actual bystanders' behaviors. Overall, these prevention and intervention efforts are making strides to create campus climates in which rape-supportive attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors are viewed as unacceptable. Finally, faith-based or religiously affiliated institutions, organizations, and sexual assault prevention programs may wish to consider incorporating a spiritual component into their comprehensive violence prevention efforts. Specifically, they might encourage and seek to strengthen the religious commitment and involvement of their student body or the individuals with whom they work, emphasizing the benefits of regular religious service attendance. In conclusion, sexual assault does not occur in a vacuum. Rather, interrelated factors, ranging from the micro to macro level, have an impact upon the prevalence and reporting of sexual assault. Neither micro nor macro level factors, however, can explain meso-level patterns, such as geographical variation in campus sexual assault rates between states and census regions, or differences in the rape reportage gap between census regions. Thus, it's crucial to examine possible meso-level social ecology factors. This study demonstrates that one such factor that warrants further investigation is aggregate religious involvement. This study is, to the best of our knowledge, the first to explore the relationship between religiosity and campus sexual assault. It thus begins to fill an important gap in the research literature. Moreover, the robust correlation between state-level religious service attendance rates and campus sexual assault rates is an important correlation regardless of whether it's due to differences in prevalence or reporting. Ultimately, only a national campus sexual assault victimization and reporting survey, valid at the level of all 50 states, can definitively explain the geographic variation that I've documented in this study. This line of inquiry is worth pursuing, however, because the answer to this question may yield valuable insights regarding campus sexual assault prevention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jirek. Our two respondents this evening are Professor Meredith Whitner and Angela Demore. I will introduce both of them, and then they will come in that order and give their responses. Meredith Whitner is an assistant professor in the Sociology and Anthropology department. After completing her BA in Gender Studies at Gordon College, she earned an MA and Ph.D. in Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. She studies the role of religion in both perpetuating and mitigating different forms of social injustice, especially related to gender. She's working on a book on how anti-apartheid religious NGOs have also addressed gender-based violence in South Africa. She teaches in the areas of sociology of race and ethnicity, sociology of global religion, and gender and cross-cultural perspective. Angela Demore has served for the past 10 years as the director of campus life at Westmont College, where she is passionate about student transformation in all of its forms: physically, spiritually, emotionally, and relationally. Previously, she served as assistant dean of the first-year students at Dartmouth College. She earned her Ph.D. in education from UCSB in 2016, where she completed her dissertation research on how Christian women envision their future. In her life outside of work, Angela and her husband, Brian, enjoy almost any form of outdoor activity, and they relish exploring the world and how it works with their two children, Luke and Maya.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Sarah for that excellent presentation, and for the privilege of getting to share a few thoughts. I am going to don a Sociology of Religion hat for a few minutes, and then a Sociology of Gender hat for a few minutes, because those are my two sort of areas that I live and swim in most of my days. And then I'll raise just a couple questions. From a Sociology of Religion perspective, I find this fascinating, and I find it particularly fascinating to think that there could be something at the level of the state, a state-level measure of religiosity that could be connected to what's happening in individual campuses and then leading to campus level differences in sexual assault. And of course, I want to know why, which is a study like this can sort of point to patterns, but we're left sort of wondering, what are the things that are involved in that? And what is it that would make a state's level of religiosity, and particularly its religious attendance rates, seem to be so important? And I want to just throw out a couple of ideas about this that I'd also be curious to hear all your thoughts on. The first is that I was struck that it seems as though there's not just an importance in religious involvement in terms of attendance, but also that there seems to be something important going on with the different types of religion. So if you look back to that table 2, evangelical Protestants stand out to me in this. Evangelical Protestants, it seems, are much less likely, if I'm reading this correctly, right? So among the different religious groups that are presented here, evangelical Protestants stand out in contrast to mainline Protestants and Catholics, for whom these results are not statistically significant. So what's going on with the evangelicals? We're at an evangelical institution. I feel like this is an important conversation, right? Is it the case that religious teachings that are in the evangelical world around things like sex and sexual activity outside of marriage, could those be something related to this negative correlation that's statistically significant, whereas Catholic and mainline Protestant teachings may not be as deeply felt and embodied? Is it the case that evangelicals, and I think this could relate to the prevalence and reporting question too, right? Is it the case that if prohibitions against sexual activity outside of marriage are more strongly taught in evangelical circles, could that also be dampening, or not, the sort of the prevalence versus reporting, right? We can imagine a scenario in which someone would be much less likely to report an instance of sexual assault if they also have a very strong religiously held belief that sex outside of marriage is not okay. So I'm curious about that. And then I also find it interesting that our nuns are showing up here, right? And I think Angela's probably going to talk about this too, so I'll leave that point for her a little bit. But it's interesting that category of religious nuns is only increasing in our society, and that it appears to be a demographic shift that is predominantly focused in this age group. So in other words, that number, the proportion of people who are identifying as not having a religious affiliation is increasing over time, and 18 to 24-year-olds are the group that seems to be making that increase. So I think that raises questions for us about whether this kind of pattern will continue, or whether we'll see a shift happen in the relationship between religiosity and campus sexual assault rates. That kind of makes sense. I'm sure you'll say more about that more brilliantly, Angela. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just losing my place in my notes. The second thing I wanted to say a little bit about, so that's my kind of religion question. Is it something about the particular beliefs that are held in and convictions in evangelical Protestantism in particular that seem to be significant here? Or to what extent is this about religion's sort of more broad moral community kind of influence on people? And I think you could make an argument either way. But it strikes me that paying attention to a particular religious belief seems like it would be very important as we think about the complexity of this, given that the findings seem so different across the different religious groups. The second point I'll make, again, and this speaks more from the gender side of things, I'm always struck as I look at these kinds of statistics, not just about what's happening on college campuses, but also about how sexual assault seems to happen more frequently among this age group, even among people who are not in college. And in particular, that the group RAIN has analyzed BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics, thank you. And they actually found that women who are not in college but are of college age are more likely to experience sexual assault than women who are in college. And they also find that men who are in college are much more likely than non-students who are men who are of the same age to be victims of sexual assault. Does that make sense? So it flips for men and women. Women who are not in college but are that age are more likely, whereas men who are in college are more likely than men who are not in college. Does that make sense? So it seems like there's something particular about campus climates that's involved in this, but there's also a sort of life course thing, I think. And I'm curious about the implications of this finding about religiosity, not just for campus climates in particular, but also for the way that gender, sexuality, sexual assault work for this particular age group. Because it seems like there's something important that's going on there that I think, again, as you're pointing to areas of future research, I think this could be a really important one. And I also wonder with that one in particular if there's a social class dimension to this, and if people who are not in college, because of the ways in which social class and education get linked to one another, if there could be social class differences when we look at in college versus not in college. So I'm curious about that. And then the final thing is, it does strike me as you pointed out that sexual assault seems distinct just looking within the campuses. Sexual assault stands out among the types of crime that are being committed, and I'm curious about that. Is that simply because the number of crimes, of those other kinds of crimes, are so much lower than sexual assaults? Is it as you're suggesting that there's a difference between knowing that you're a perpetrator versus not knowing the perpetrator? But it seems to me like there's something that, especially given that we're at an Institute of Higher Education, it seems to me like this raises a question for us around what are the particularities of sexual assault that would make it would make religiosity matter so much for it, and not for other kinds of crime? Is it because we more readily identify those other kinds of things as crime and not this? Is it about violence and the meaning that we make of violence and how we think we should respond to violence, or something else? There's a question for me there, and I'd love to hear. I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, so I'd just love to hear more of your musings on it. And then I'll just close with something that I think might be kind of practical, and that is, as you're pointing out about the dimensions of the Clery Act, and I think the point at the end about the auditing, points to something that sociologists have talked about a lot, about the idea of social desirability. That is, that on issues like this, we tend to answer the question the way that we think society wants us to answer it, right? And it seems to me like there are these very practical implications about either enforcing the fines, if we want to go that route, right? Or I also wonder about internal campus climate and culture, and how might we, as people who are at an institution of higher education, make it more, make for a more supportive, perhaps empathetic, or at least trusting environment, in order to be able to reduce the likelihood that we might only report things when we know that we're being audited. And perhaps we might consider that we're being audited all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. And I think that perhaps there's something that distinctly Christian or religious institutions might be able to sort of offer in that regard. So I'll leave it at there and turn it over to Angela. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks again, Sarah, for your important research here. As I think about sexual assault more broadly, I'm aware of the layer upon layer of implications, both personally to people who are assaulted, to friends of those who are assaulted, to the communities of those who have experienced the assault. I think about individuals and not only the physical ramifications, but the psychological, the emotional, the long-term impacts on them there, including things like serious depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, conditions like dissociation, where there's this sort of detachment from reality that happens to victims. And these conditions can take years and even a lifetime to recover from. Part of my role as director of campus life, that means I'm sometimes involved in cases of examining sexual assault on our campus. And that's a hard role to be in. And one thing I'll say about it is that there are never any winners. No matter what you find, no matter where you land, as you're trying to find facts. These are people's lives that have been impacted on both sides, and you realize there's a lot of pain in the community. I think about the woman who carried the mattress across the stage, and even if the person that she had asked to be expelled had been, I just wonder, I doubt that would have solved, the issue for that woman. But all that to say, religious communities certainly aren't immune, and I appreciate the look and the deeper look at the connections between religiosity and sexual assault. My experience has been that there is an assumption often of coming to places like Westmont that these types of things don't happen. And while the incidence rates of assault aren't as high here as other institutions, it does happen. So between 2014 and 16, there were 5 forcible sexual offenses reported on our campus, and that number is just part of that Clery data that Sarah used in her research. It's accessible to the public, and I think there can be a bit of a false sense of security in communities like these that comes along with a higher level of trust, which sometimes can, frankly, be dangerous, particularly when alcohol is involved. A sense of we're safe here, we can trust one another, and I don't need to safeguard myself against potential harm. So those are some things I've witnessed and seen, even in our community. So I want to take just a minute because religiosity and thinking about religion brings up the case of what is happening more broadly in America as far as the changing religious landscape in America, and I think this has implications for this research. So just recently, last month, September of 2017, there was a public Religion Research Institute report came out that showed pretty clearly that the American religious landscape is undergoing a pretty dramatic transformation. So white Christians, once the dominant religious group in the US, now account for fewer than half of all of the adults living in the country. In contrast, in 1976 in the US, 81% of Americans identified as white and Christian. That's a pretty dramatic change. Now it's in the high 40s, so pretty dramatic change over these past years. So as I said today, fewer than half of all states are majority white Christian, and the growing minority is, of course, this nuns, this group that we've talked about or identified as secular. Also, America's youngest religious groups are all non-Christian. Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists are all far younger than Christian groups. So Christian groups are aging. So some of these questions bring up for me, some of these changes bring up for me the question of, with the decreasing and changing religiosity across the nation, has there been a related increase in sexual assault nationwide? That'd be a question I'd be interested in seeing and looking at the trends. And that would, of course, relate to one of the two options here of the prevalence. If the prevalence rate of sexual assault is related to religiosity, and religiosity in America is overall, the trend is going down, does that mean we've had rising rates of sexual assault? With religious diversity on the rise, certainly there's fewer common faith strands that hold us together as a nation. And there might be an increased need for some sort of common set of values that in some cases go beyond tolerance. So let's see. As a practitioner, primarily, I'm not somebody who spends a whole lot of my time doing research. So when I hear and think about these issues, I tend to jump pretty immediately to the, okay, so what, now what? And so I will say that as Christians, we of course focus quite a bit on what I call, I guess, the golden rule and doing unto others as you'd have them do unto you, and the idea of loving our enemies, the focus on understanding others and caring for others, I believe is ingrained in our faith. So part of my work is leadership development here. And in the past 20 years or so, the research on effective leaders and on relationship builders has focused largely on a concept that probably most of you are familiar with called emotional intelligence. And one of the key elements of emotional intelligence is empathy, or the ability to understand other people's emotional makeup. Not just knowing what another person's feeling, but understanding the perspectives of others. It's easy to think that you either have empathy or you don't, but the research actually shows that empathy itself can be developed. And I think we do a reasonable job of developing that in the church. So by actually practicing empathetic skills, we can actually change the ways our brains work that allow us to be more empathetic in the future. This includes developing curiosity and the ability to ask good questions, developing effective listening skills, and mindfulness training. So part of what I wonder is if sexual assault training can include more of an empathy curriculum, because if one can develop the ability to understand what somebody else is feeling, the pain of a survivor, for example, one might be less likely to perpetuate assault and be more likely to intervene as well as a bystander and to prevent harm to another. So in my work, part of what we do, and probably some of what all of you have participated in, or many of you, is we do an online course called Campus Clarity, and it includes information about consent, and it includes information about bystander intervention and alcohol and these other important topics. But I just wonder about that empathy piece. Simply in our communities, in our college communities, can we collectively increase the ability to understand how others feel and put ourselves in their shoes? I just have a couple final comments, questions. I'm just struck from my experiences and what I understand. 50% or more of college sexual assaults involve alcohol. And Sarah pointed out in her implications that if there is indeed a lower incidence rate of assault associated with religiosity, then it might be due, as she mentioned, to lower rates of partying or alcohol use. I think it'd be valuable to look further and examine further research on religiosity and alcohol use or partying. Perhaps that's been done, but that's a question that comes to my mind. I'd like to see the link, since alcohol seems to be such a key factor in sexual assaults. So if religiosity does seem to significantly stem alcohol use, perhaps that could be a key to helping understand what's at the core of this significant correlation. Finally, just a note on rape culture, because that also seems to be such a key element related to sexual assault. I wonder if rape culture is more institutional or more regional. I think about cities like Boston, and Massachusetts, of course, is one of these lower rates of religiosity, higher rates of sexual assault. I think about cities like Boston with over 35 institutions of higher education right in one city. And while I'm sure each institution has their own culture, I'm guessing that the shared context of the city and the social scene in the city shapes the culture of those institutions, both for better and sometimes worse. So I'm curious about both the state level versus individual institutions versus maybe the culture of a city or place. I think about Westmont and the connections we have even in our city with UCSB and City College, and how our communities and cultures shape one another. So I just wonder about some of those connections too. But thanks again, Sarah, for your research.
So let me invite our speaker back up to say a few words in response, and then I will leave it to you when you're done to invite the other respondents back up and self-moderate the rest of it, giving priority to students.
Okay, so where to start? I really appreciated, Dr. D'Amour, how you brought up the Public Religion Research Institute report of 2017. And this changing, we really are in a period of change of what the religious landscape in the United States looks like, especially among the age group that many of you in this room fall in, the college age group and young adults. I think one of the factors that religious nuns are the fastest growing religious group in the United States, one of the things that points to then in our research study is that religion is not the only factor that's playing into prevalence rates and reporting rates of campus sexual assault. There are changing norms across the country regarding issues of consent, regarding how people think about campus sexual assault, the awareness that people have of it. And slowly but surely, I think we are moving in positive directions regarding taking this as a serious issue, less blaming of the victim, still tons of it happening, but less than a generation or two ago. So in answering, or at least beginning to address Dr. D'Amour's question of, since we do have decreasing amounts of individuals who identify as being religious, who identify as having that be a very important or important part of their life, she posed the question, has there been a corresponding increase in the sexual assault rate nationwide? I actually brought with me, and thankfully she gave me a heads up, I'm grateful to you on that topic. So I brought with me a special report by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's Rape and Sexual Assault Victimization Among College-Aged Females, 1995 to 2013. That's the most recent I could find is the 2013, but it shows a significant span of time trends. And buried in the report, it's like a 19-page report, is some 1997 through 2013 trends regarding rape or sexual assault for women, and whether they are students, not students. And what's been happening across the board from 1997 to 2013, it's jagged lines, but it's a downward line for both students and non-students. So to translate that real quick, so sexual assault rates for both students and non-students in 2013 are quite lower than in 1997. There's, again, individual fluctuations between various years, but we have seen a decrease, and that is from National Crime Victimization Survey data. So again, victimization survey data tend to get more incidents, more reports. People feel a lot more comfortable in a confidential setting of a survey where there's no formal requirement for them to report to the police or to campus administrators. So we tend, those of us who study violence against women, we tend to believe victimization reports come closer in estimating the prevalence. So even though, that's encouraging that even though there is a decrease in religiosity across the United States over the past 15 plus years, there is also a decrease in sexual assault rates. So again, that kind of reiterates religion is not the only factor. There's a lot of factors at work here, and religious involvement is one of them, but not the only one. Let me touch upon a point that Dr. Whitner raised. So evangelicals, we're an evangelical institution, as she pointed out. There were definite differences between the evangelicals, so she was referring to Table 2, and the findings that those relationships that I talked about were present for evangelical Protestants. But when you parse it out, it wasn't true of other Christian groups. Catholics did not have those same associations. Mainline Protestants did not have those associations. So what's up with evangelicals is a great question to pose. And I don't claim to have full answers, just some initial thoughts. So first of all, there was in mid-1960s, a study done by Rodney Stark, which was really controversial, where he was asserting a Hellfire Hypothesis in trying to explain why some groups of people might be less likely to engage in acts of deviance or violence. And the idea of the Hellfire Hypothesis was basically, how scared of hell are you? Do you believe hell exists? Do you believe it's a real place? And that if you don't live in a certain way, you might end up there. So it was very much a hypothesis based on, essentially, the more scared you are of the fire of hell, the less likely you are to deviate from a certain path of living. And there was so much debate about this Hellfire Hypothesis, all sorts of studies coming up with a variety. That was during that era in which the studies on the relationship between religiosity and crime varied widely. There was no consensus. Very different measures, very different ways of conducting the studies, of defining the terms. And so in some ways, researchers talked past each other, as we often do. But that idea of who believes in hell, a former iteration of this paper was way too long for a journal, and had a pretty chunky paragraph in there about the Hellfire Hypothesis, and actually looking at the belief in hell is actually measured by the Pew Landscape folks of who believes in hell really strongly. And evangelical Protestants are the group that, compared to Catholics, mainline Protestants, let alone unaffiliated religious individuals, believe that hell is a real place, believe that their behaviors could potentially result in having a too close of an association with hell someday in the future, and that Catholics had a lower percentage, of Catholics believe in hell as being a real place, and also a lower percentage of mainline Protestants, and then a way lower percentage of religiously unaffiliated, the religious nuns, believing in hell. So that's been one hypothesis thrown out there. Other things that came to mind when Dr. Whitner was talking, I know there have been events on our campus, I believe last spring, and I'm sure multiple others, about the idea of purity culture and the social norms surrounding sexuality, particularly women's sexuality, in predominantly evangelical Protestant culture. So that's another thing that comes to mind of when you raise that question, what's unique about evangelicals? Those are 2 points, and again, we need more research to answer these questions more fully. But that's what comes to mind when you raise that. Another point, Dr. Damore, I really appreciated your discussion of empathy. The programs that I'm most familiar with that have been used most widely on campuses for campus sexual assault prevention and intervention work, at least 2 that I can think of do have modules or portions of it where empathy is addressed. However, I don't think it's as significant of a part of their curriculum as you were mentioning, or as central to the philosophy embedded within them regarding how we might address and have as a possible solution to reducing sexual assault on campus. So that's a fantastic idea, and I think that is something that innovative programs on campus sexual assault prevention should look at a minimum. Let's try it out. That's what science does. Let's evaluate the results and see what those, if we see a significant difference after that kind of training. Let's see here. There were so many points raised. I appreciate just I think both of our respondents did a great job of continuing the conversation that I don't have answers to all of the questions raised, and that's great. That's exciting. Instead of that being a threatening, scary thing, it's an encouragement of there's more research needed. There are exciting directions to go with this. There's avenues to research, things about what is distinctive about sexual assault compared to other crimes in the campus data, because that was an unexpected finding. And it's not an easy to explain one. I offered one possible idea, but it's an interpretation. An idea. And so continuing to try to explore what might be distinctive about sexual assault, where religiosity has a particular impact on our sexual behaviors and less of an impact on things like violence against a stranger or against someone's personal belongings, are questions to consider. Dr. Damore raised the question that we need more research on the relationship between religiosity and party culture, between religiosity and alcohol use. Bless you. It has been found that, like 80%, 79 to 80% of studies, 79 to 80% of campus sexual assaults have been found to involve alcohol on part of the perpetrator, the victim, or both. So those are important links to look at, religiosity and alcohol or partying.
We are almost out of time,
Okay.
so let me cut this off and ask for questions from students.